This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Koroma, a small, sun-soaked town nestled on the southern coast of West Africa, appeared to be an oasis of calm and tradition. Its streets, lined with modest homes painted in earthy tones of brown and ochre, were often quiet, save for the occasional murmur of children playing, the rustle of the palm trees in the breeze, and the steady hum of insects. The town's beauty wasn't the loud, vibrant kind. It was more subdued, understated, like the steady rhythm of the waves lapping against the shore. For those passing through, Koroma seemed almost untouched by time, rooted in its ways, sheltered from the fast pace of the world outside. Amidst the tranquility, there was one family that had always stood apart: the Obis. For as long as anyone could remember, the Obis had been considered one of Koroma's most respectable families. Known for their wealth and influence, the family lived in a large compound on the outskirts of town, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls and lush gardens. The patriarch, Chief Obi, had been a man of considerable means and status, his wealth built on trade and shrewd land deals. The house itself, with its whitewashed walls and imposing iron gate, was a symbol of the family's stature, an embodiment of the chief's success. But things had changed since Chief Obi's sudden death 2 years earlier. Without him, the Obis had lost their guiding force, the man who had kept the family united and strong. He had left behind his second wife, Martha, and his 3 sons from his previous marriage, Emeka, Ife, and Chuka. The death of the chief had sent shockwaves through the family, but it was what followed in the years after that would truly unravel the Obis. Martha, though not a native of Koroma, had come to the town years earlier from the bustling city of Lagos. She was strikingly beautiful, with sharp features and a charisma that could easily captivate those around her. In her early 40s, she still possessed the allure that had first caught the late chief's eye. Many whispered about how quickly the widowed Martha had risen to her position, marrying Chief Obi after his first wife had passed under mysterious circumstances. Martha had been a nurse when she met the chief, offering him comfort and companionship in his grief. Their marriage had shocked many in Koroma, especially since Chief Obi's sons had only just begun to recover from the loss of their mother. The townspeople had never fully accepted Martha as one of their own. Despite her status as the late chief's widow, she remained an outsider, regarded with suspicion by the older women and with veiled jealousy by the younger. Rumors circulated about her motives, her ambition, and her relationship with the chief's sons. Some whispered that she had married the chief for his wealth, while others suggested she had brought misfortune to the family. But in Koroma, such gossip was often kept to the shadows, exchanged in hushed voices over evening meals or in the privacy of homes. After the chief's death, Martha found herself in an unfamiliar and precarious position. She was now the head of a family that did not fully belong to her, a family that was already fragmented and burdened by the weight of grief and loss. Emeka, Ife, and Chuka had each reacted to their father's death in different ways, but none of them had turned to Martha for guidance or comfort. Though they shared the same house, there was a distance between them, an invisible wall that seemed to grow higher with each passing day. Emeka, the eldest at 25, had taken on the mantle of leadership in the family after his father's death, though not without resentment. He had always been the serious one, the son who had followed in Chief Obi's footsteps most closely, studying business and preparing to manage the family's affairs. He was handsome, with a strong jawline and a stern, brooding presence that intimidated many. Emeka had inherited his father's sense of responsibility, but also his pride and rigid expectations. He carried the weight of the Obi legacy on his shoulders, determined to preserve the family's name and honor, even if it meant distancing himself emotionally from his younger brothers and stepmother. Ife at 23 was different. He had always been more sensitive, more attuned to the emotional undercurrents in the family. Where Emeka was driven by duty, Ife often found himself questioning the rigid traditions of the Obi household. He had been close to his mother before her death, and her loss had left him deeply wounded. Ife had inherited her gentle demeanor, along with her love of music and literature. While Emeka worked to uphold the family's business, Ife pursued creative interests, much to the frustration of his older brother, who saw him as aimless and impractical. Ife's relationship with Martha had always been strained, though he had been the first to show her any kindness after she married his father. Yet, deep down, Ife remained suspicious of her intentions, sensing that Martha was far more calculating than she let on. Chuka, the youngest at 19, had been just a boy when his mother died, and he barely remembered her. He had grown up in a world shaped by loss, first of his mother and then of his father. As a result, Chuka had developed a rebellious streak, often pushing back against the expectations placed on him by his family and the town. Unlike Emeka, who was driven by a sense of duty, or Ife, who sought solace in creativity, Chuka was restless, always searching for something to fill the void left by his parents' deaths. He had become known in Koroma for his wild behavior, his nights spent drinking with friends and getting into trouble. While Emeka disapproved and Ife tried to understand, neither truly knew how to reach him. Martha, for her part, was acutely aware of the tensions in the household. Though she was officially the matriarch, she held little real power over her stepsons. They did not respect her, and her attempts to assert authority were often met with cold indifference or open hostility. She had tried, at first, to forge a connection with them after their father's death, offering them the comfort of a mother figure. But the boys had grown up without her, and they saw her as an interloper, someone who had inserted herself into their family when they were at their most vulnerable. Over time, Martha's efforts to bridge the gap between herself and the boys shifted. Where kindness had failed, she turned to manipulation. She was no longer content with the role of passive widow, quietly managing the household while her stepsons went about their lives. Martha wanted more control, influence, and perhaps most of all, validation. Though she had been married to the chief, his death had left her with little beyond a fading title and a tenuous hold on the family's wealth. The Obi estate was still in the name of her stepsons, and while she managed the day-to-day affairs of the household, she knew that her position was not secure. As the months passed, Martha began to weave herself into the lives of Emeka, Ife, and Chuka in ways that blurred the boundaries between mother and stepmother, between authority and temptation. She had always been a woman of deep desires, and the isolation she felt after the chief's death left her vulnerable to those desires. The boys, each struggling with their own grief and emotional wounds, became easy targets for her manipulation. Emeka, with his sense of duty and need for control, was the first to succumb. Martha recognized in him a mirror of her own ambitions, a desire for power and recognition that could be exploited. She played on his need for validation, subtly flattering him, making him feel that he, too, could be a man of influence, just like his father. What began as innocent conversations about the family's future soon turned into something more intimate. Martha knew how to read people, and she quickly understood that Emeka's outward strength masked a deep insecurity, a need to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. Ife, with his sensitive nature and emotional openness, was next. He had always been more vulnerable, more likely to seek out comfort in the face of his family's coldness. Martha became that comfort, offering him the kind of attention he had long craved. She listened to him in a way his brothers never had, and slowly he found himself drawn to her. Her beauty, her charm, her ability to understand his emotional needs had all made her irresistible to him. What started as a surrogate mother-son relationship evolved into something far more complicated. Chuka, the most rebellious and emotionally volatile of the three, was the last to fall under Martha's spell. His relationship with her had always been the most antagonistic, as he saw through her attempts to control the household. But Martha, ever the strategist, recognized that his defiance was simply a mask for the deep emotional wounds he carried. She approached him differently, challenging his assumptions, pushing back against his rebellion in a way that intrigued him. Slowly, she broke down his defenses, and Chuka, too, found himself entangled in her web. What none of the brothers realized was that they were all being manipulated, their individual vulnerabilities exploited by Martha for her own gain. She thrived on the power she wielded over them, drawing each one deeper into her orbit, while keeping them unaware of her relationships with the others. The Obi household, once held together by the legacy of their father, was now a simmering cauldron of secrets, lies, and forbidden desires. Koroma, for all its quiet beauty, was about to become the backdrop for a tragedy that would shock the town to its core. Behind the walls of the Obi estate, the slow unraveling of a family had begun, a descent into darkness that no one could have foreseen. And at the center of it all stood Martha, the widow who had transformed from a grieving outsider into a master manipulator, pulling the strings of the men who should have been her family. After the death of Chief Obi, the family estate in Koroma began to change, but the transformation was slow and insidious, like a creeping vine that silently takes over a once well-tended garden. At the heart of this change was Martha, the widow who had married into the Obi family late in life, and was now left to navigate a household of grieving, restless men, her three stepsons. Over time, what had started as subtle shifts in power and control evolved into something much darker and more dangerous. Martha's role in the family had always been ambiguous. Though she had been married to Chief Obi, his sons had never fully accepted her as part of the family. They tolerated her out of respect for their father, but after his death, that fragile bond of obligation began to fray. Martha, in turn, had felt increasingly isolated. She had never been truly embraced by the town of Koroma either. Her presence there was an oddity, a woman from the city thrust into the quiet rhythms of village life, where gossip traveled fast and loyalties were forged over generations. But while the town had kept its distance, it was inside the walls of the Obi estate that the real drama unfolded. Martha's beauty was undeniable, even in her early 40s. Her sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes, and full lips had captivated Chief Obi when he first met her, and that allure had not diminished with time. If anything, the power she wielded over others had grown more refined. She was no longer the young, hopeful woman who had married the chief, seeking stability and a new life away from the chaos of Lagos. Now she was a widow with much to lose and even more to gain, if she could only hold on to the fragile grip she had over the family. The relationship dynamics within the Obi household were complex, a web of power, resentment, and unspoken desires. Martha's stepsons Emeka, Ife, and Chuka had each reacted to their father's death in different ways, but all were struggling to find their place in the new family order. Emeka, the eldest, took on the burden of responsibility, trying to fill the void left by his father's death. He focused on the family business and the estate, determined to preserve the Obi legacy. Ife, the middle son, drifted through life in a haze of creativity and confusion, seeking solace in music and books, but never fully engaging with the family's responsibilities. Chuka, the youngest, was a storm of anger and rebellion, his grief manifesting in self-destructive behavior that only deepened the tensions in the house. In the months following Chief Obi's death, Martha began to subtly insert herself into the lives of these men, each in different ways. She had always been astute in reading people, and she quickly recognized the vulnerabilities of each of her stepsons. Where before she had been content to play the role of the distant stepmother, now she saw an opportunity to fill the emotional void left by their father. But this was not an innocent desire to help, it was something far more calculated. Martha was driven by a need for control, validation, and the power that came from manipulating those around her. Emeka, with his rigid sense of duty and responsibility, was the first to fall into Martha's web. He had always been the most distant from her, viewing her as an outsider who had never truly belonged in the family. But as he took on more of the family's burdens, Martha positioned herself as an ally, someone who understood the pressures he faced. She began to spend more time with him, offering advice on managing the estate and the business, speaking in tones that were laced with admiration for his strength and dedication. Over time, Emeka's initial weariness gave way to a kind of dependence. He began to see Martha not as a threat, but as a confidante, someone who could help him shoulder the weight of his responsibilities. Martha was careful not to push too hard, at first. She knew that Emeka was proud, that he would resist any overt attempts to influence him. But she played on his insecurities, subtly planting the seeds of doubt in his mind about his ability to live up to his father's legacy. She praised him, but in ways that made him crave more validation. Slowly, her relationship with Emeka shifted. It moved from one of distant respect to something far more intimate. Martha used her charm and physical allure to break down his defenses, knowing that Emeka, for all his strength, was still a young man, vulnerable to the attention of a beautiful woman. Ife was a different challenge altogether. Where Emeka had resisted her at first, Ife had always been more open to Martha, though not without reservations. He had a softer nature, one that was more inclined to seek emotional connections. He had been deeply affected by his mother's death, and though he was older now, the scars of that loss had never fully healed. Martha saw in Ife a sensitivity that she could exploit. She positioned herself as a surrogate mother figure, offering him the kind of emotional support that his older brother could not. But Martha's intentions were far from maternal. She saw in Ife a malleability, a need for affection that she could twist to her advantage. She began to nurture Ife's creative side, encouraging him in ways that his father never had. She listened to his music, read the poetry he scribbled in his notebooks, and gave him the attention he had long craved. In doing so, Martha created a bond with Ife that was built on his need for validation and her ability to provide it. But as with Emeka, this connection soon turned into something darker. Martha knew how to present herself as the answer to Ife's unspoken desires. She played the role of the caring, attentive figure in his life. But behind her kindness was a calculated manipulation. She understood that Ife's vulnerability made him easy to control, and she used that to her advantage, drawing him into a relationship that blurred the boundaries between stepmother and something far more forbidden. Chuka, the youngest, was the most difficult of the three to manage. He had always been rebellious, resisting authority at every turn, and his relationship with Martha had been openly hostile from the beginning. Where his brothers had been willing to tolerate her presence, Chuka had never hidden his disdain. He viewed Martha as an outsider, a woman who had wormed her way into the family for her own gain. After his father's death, that hostility only deepened. Chuka spent less time at home, retreating into a world of drinking, partying, and reckless behavior that caused no small amount of scandal in Koroma. But Martha was nothing if not patient. She understood that Chuka's rebellion was a mask for the deep pain he carried inside. He had been just a boy when his mother died, and he had never truly processed the grief of losing her. Now, with his father gone as well, Chuka was a young man adrift, searching for something to anchor him. Martha began her work on him slowly, knowing that any overt attempts to reach him would be met with resistance. She didn't try to mother him, that would have been a mistake. Instead, she approached him on his own terms, challenging him, pushing back against his rebellious nature in ways that intrigued him. Chuka was used to people, especially women, either scolding him or trying to save him. Martha did neither. She met his defiance with her own brand of cool detachment, refusing to play the role he expected of her. This dynamic sparked a strange fascination in Chuka, who began to view Martha in a new light. Where before he had seen her as a manipulative outsider, now he saw her as someone who understood his anger, who wasn't afraid to confront him. Martha, always calculating, allowed this perception to grow, knowing that it would draw Chuka closer to her. And it did. Over time, Martha's relationships with the three brothers deepened. Each one was drawn to her in different ways, their individual needs and vulnerabilities carefully cultivated by Martha's manipulations. With Emeka, she played the role of the wise, supportive figure, offering him the validation and encouragement he needed to feel in control. With Ife, became the caring, nurturing presence he had longed for, drawing him into an emotional dependence that blurred the lines between affection and desire. And with Chuka, she fed his rebellious spirit, offering him a relationship that was built on challenge and intrigue, drawing him into a dangerous game of power and attraction. None of the brothers knew about the others. Martha was careful to keep her affairs with them separate, maintaining a delicate balance that allowed her to control the situation without arousing suspicion. To Emeka, Ife, and Chuka, their relationships with her were unique, special. Each believed that they alone had captured Martha's attention, that they alone were the focus of her affection. It was this belief that allowed Martha to maintain her grip on the family, manipulating each brother into further dependence on her. But as the months passed, the cracks in this carefully constructed facade began to show. Jealousy and tension started to creep into the household, though none of the brothers could quite pinpoint the source of their unease. Emeka began to notice the small changes in Martha's behavior, how she seemed distant at times, distracted. Ife, sensitive to the emotional undercurrents in the house, felt a growing discomfort, though he couldn't put it into words. Chuka, ever suspicious, started to wonder if there was more to Martha's attention than he had originally thought. But even as these doubts surfaced, none of the brothers could bring themselves to confront Martha. She had become too deeply embedded in their lives, too integral to their sense of self, for them to easily let her go. For Martha, the thrill of her control over the brothers was intoxicating. She reveled in the power she held, in the way she could manipulate their emotions, their desires, their very identities. But she was also aware that this power came with risks. The more she played with the brothers' affections, the more dangerous the situation became. Jealousy, after all, was a powerful emotion, and it was only a matter of time before the brothers' suspicions began to unravel the delicate web she had woven. The household, once held together by the shared grief of Chief Obi's death, was now a tinderbox of emotions: jealousy, anger, desire, all waiting for a single spark to set it alight. Martha, always calculating, believed she could manage it. She believed that her control over the brothers was strong enough to keep them in line, to prevent the truth of her affairs from coming to light. But in her arrogance, she underestimated the depths of their emotions and the dangerous game she was playing with their lives. As the tension in the house grew, so too did the cracks in Martha's carefully constructed world. The brothers, once united in their grief, were now on the verge of being torn apart by the very woman who had inserted herself into their lives. What none of them could see was that the seeds of their own destruction had already been planted, and it was only a matter of time before Martha's manipulations would lead to a tragedy that would destroy the family once and for all. Koroma, with its quiet streets and peaceful rhythms, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind the walls of the Obi estate. But for those within the house, the days of secrecy and control were numbered. The web of desire, manipulation, and power that Martha had spun was beginning to unravel, and soon, the truth would come crashing down in a way that none of them could have predicted. As the months passed, the once placid atmosphere inside the Obi estate began to shift. Though the change was imperceptible at first, the dynamics between Martha and her three stepsons had grown increasingly complex, with each man caught in the tangled web of desire and manipulation that she had woven around them. Martha, now thoroughly entrenched in her secret affairs with Emeka, Ife and Chuka, believed she could maintain control, carefully navigating the dangerous waters of her illicit relationships. But as desire deepened into obsession and jealousy took root, the fragile balance she had created began to teeter. At the heart of this growing unrest was Emeka, the eldest of the Obi brothers. From the outside, he remained the stoic leader, the one who had assumed the mantle of responsibility after their father's death. He had taken on the management of the family business and the estate, striving to live up to the legacy left by Chief Obi. But behind his composed exterior, Emeka was wrestling with emotions that he could not fully understand. His relationship with Martha, which had begun as a strange, unspoken alliance built on mutual respect, had evolved into something far more personal and dangerous. Emeka's initial resistance to Martha's charms had long since faded. He had come to rely on her not only for advice in managing the estate but for emotional validation as well. Her attentions had filled a void in his life, a void left by the death of his father and the absence of any meaningful romantic relationships. Yet, as his attachment to Martha deepened, so too did his need for exclusivity. Emeka, who prided himself on control in all aspects of his life, found himself increasingly possessive of Martha, though he could not voice these feelings openly. This possessiveness was exacerbated by a growing unease that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. Emeka had noticed subtle changes in Martha's behavior over the past few months, small, almost imperceptible shifts in the way she interacted with him. At times she seemed distant, her attention elsewhere. She no longer seemed as invested in their private moments, her gaze occasionally drifting to something or someone beyond his grasp. These observations, though minor, planted the seeds of doubt in Emeka's mind, and that doubt soon began to fester. Meanwhile, Ife, the middle brother, was dealing with his own emotional turmoil. His relationship with Martha had also deepened, though it had taken a different path from Emeka's. Ife had always been the more sensitive and introspective of the three brothers, and Martha had expertly positioned herself as his emotional anchor. She had become the listener, the confidante, the one who understood him in ways that his brothers never could. Ife's creative nature had always set him apart from the rigid expectations of the Obi family, and Martha had encouraged this side of him, making him feel seen and appreciated in a way that few others had. But Ife's growing dependence on Martha also came with a price. He had begun to sense, much like Emeka, that he was not alone in her affections. While Martha still lavished him with attention, there were moments when her gaze would flicker, moments when her touch seemed more distracted, as if her mind was elsewhere. These moments, fleeting as they were, cut deep into Ife's fragile sense of security. He had always been emotionally attuned to the people around him, and now he could feel something shifting between him and Martha, something that he couldn't quite name. But that filled him with a creeping sense of dread. The tension between Emeka and Ife, though unspoken, began to simmer beneath the surface. Neither brother was fully aware of the other's relationship with Martha, but each had started to sense that there was a competitor for her affections. This growing suspicion fed into a subtle, unspoken rivalry between them. Their conversations, once cordial if distant, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Emeka's occasional brusqueness, which Ife had once attributed to his older brother's natural demeanor, began to take on a more personal edge, while Ife's once patient manner grew increasingly brittle. The brothers found themselves in a silent contest for Martha's attention, though neither could admit it, even to themselves. Then there was Chuka, the youngest and most volatile of the three. His relationship with Martha had always been the most antagonistic, but in recent months, that antagonism had given way to something far more dangerous. Chuka's rebellious nature had made him resistant to Martha's initial attempts to control him, but over time, her persistence had worn him down. What began as a battle of wills had evolved into a strange, almost perverse bond between them, one built on a foundation of challenge and intrigue. For Chuka, Martha represented everything he had resisted about his family's legacy. She was the embodiment of the control and authority he had spent his young life rebelling against. But at the same time, her willingness to confront him, to push back against his defiance, had stirred something in him. He had come to respect her in a way, even as he continued to resist her influence. This dynamic had slowly drawn him into Martha's orbit, and he found himself craving the attention she gave him, even if it was laced with manipulation. Chuka's growing attachment to Martha, however, did not go unnoticed by his brothers. Emeka, in particular, had started to sense a shift in Chuka's behavior, small things that indicated his youngest brother was no longer as openly hostile toward Martha as he once had been. Emeka, already suspicious of Martha's shifting affections, began to wonder if Chuka had somehow found a way into her confidence. This suspicion fueled Emeka's jealousy, though he kept it buried beneath the surface, unwilling to confront the possibility head-on. For Ife, Chuka's relationship with Martha was less clear, but he too had noticed the subtle changes in the dynamic between them. Where Chuka had once spoken openly about his disdain for Martha, he now seemed more reserved, less willing to engage in the usual complaints about their stepmother. Ife, always the most perceptive of the three, picked up on these changes, though he didn't fully understand their significance. Still, they added to the growing sense of unease that had taken root in his mind, making him question the true nature of Martha's relationship with each of them. As the weeks passed, the tension in the household became more palpable. What had once been an unspoken rivalry between Emeka, Ife, and Chuka began to take on a more dangerous tone. Each brother in his own way had become increasingly possessive of Martha, though none could openly acknowledge it. The secrecy that had once allowed Martha to maintain control over the family was now beginning to unravel, as jealousy and suspicion took hold. Emeka, driven by his need for control, found himself increasingly frustrated by Martha's seeming distance. He began to demand more of her time, insisting on private meetings to discuss family matters, though these meetings were often little more than an excuse to be alone with her. His jealousy, though still buried, had begun to manifest in small, passive-aggressive gestures, cutting comments aimed at Chuka's behavior, subtle digs at Ife's lack of responsibility. These remarks, once taken in stride by his brothers, now landed with more force, each one laced with the unspoken tension that had come to define their interactions. Ife, in contrast, grew more withdrawn as the weeks passed. His once open and affectionate relationship with Martha had become strained, as he began to suspect that he was no longer her sole focus. This suspicion, combined with his natural sensitivity, made him pull away, retreating into his music and writing as a way of coping with the growing distance between him and Martha. But even in his retreat, Ife could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He began to notice the small looks that passed between Martha and Emeka, the way Chuka seemed to be spending more time around her. These observations gnawed at him, feeding his growing jealousy, though he could not bring himself to confront either of his brothers about it. Chuka, for his part, remained outwardly defiant, though beneath his rebellious exterior, he was increasingly drawn to Martha. His relationship with her had become something of a game, one that he both enjoyed and resented. He knew that Martha was manipulating him, just as she had manipulated his brothers, but he couldn't bring himself to break free from her influence. The attention she gave him, the way she challenged him, had become a source of excitement in his otherwise chaotic life. But even as he indulged in this dangerous dynamic, Chuka could sense the growing tension in the house. He saw the way Emeka and Ife looked at him, the unspoken rivalry that had begun to form between them. And though he didn't fully understand the depth of their jealousy, he knew that something was coming to a head. Martha, ever the manipulator, was fully aware of the tensions brewing between the brothers. She could feel the weight of their jealousy pressing down on her, but rather than diffusing the situation, she seemed to thrive on it. The more the brothers vied for her attention, the more powerful she felt. She had always craved control, and now she had it: three men, each desperate for her affection, each willing to sacrifice a piece of themselves to maintain their place in her life. But Martha's desire for control had blinded her to the danger she was courting. She believed that she could keep the brothers in line, that their jealousy and rivalry would remain beneath the surface, carefully managed by her manipulations. What she didn't realize was that the bonds holding the family together were fraying faster than she could repair them. The tension that had once simmered quietly was now on the verge of boiling over, and when it did, the consequences would be catastrophic. The household, once a place of uneasy peace, was now a battleground of emotions. Jealousy, suspicion, and resentment hung in the air, thickening with each passing day. The brothers, once united by their shared grief, were now divided by their unspoken desires and the growing sense of betrayal that each felt, though none could fully articulate why. And at the center of it all was Martha, the widow who had once been an outsider, now the focal point of the family's unraveling. As the days wore on, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. Small conflicts began to erupt between the brothers over household matters, over business decisions, over seemingly trivial issues that were, in reality, symptoms of the deeper emotional rifts that had formed. Emeka, ever the disciplinarian, became more authoritarian in his dealings with Ife and Chuka, while Ife grew increasingly resentful of his older brother's dominance. Chuka, feeling the pressure from both of his brothers, lashed out in unpredictable ways, his anger masking the deeper confusion and jealousy that churned inside him. The once stable foundation of the Obi family was now crumbling, and though none of the brothers fully understood the reasons for their growing animosity, they each sensed that it was connected to Martha. She had become the fulcrum around which their lives revolved, the source of both their comfort and their torment. And as the tensions in the house reached a fever pitch, it became clear that something was about to break. Martha, for all her cunning, had underestimated the power of the emotions she had unleashed. She had believed that she could control the jealousy, the possessiveness, the desire that each brother felt for her. But now, as the storm clouds gathered over the Obi estate, it was only a matter of time before the full force of their emotions erupted. And when it did, the consequences would be far more devastating than she had ever anticipated. The slow unraveling of the Obi family had been building for months, hidden beneath the surface of daily life within the large estate. The growing tension between Martha and her three stepsons Emeka, Ife and Chuka had become palpable, an unspoken conflict that simmered just beneath the veneer of civility. Each brother, caught in his own entanglement with Martha, sensed that something was wrong, but none were prepared for the revelation that would soon tear the family apart. Martha, once the charismatic and alluring stepmother who had manipulated her way into each of the brothers' lives, had long since lost control of the delicate balance she had maintained. Her relationships with the brothers, each one a separate, secret affair, had begun to blur, and the subtle power she wielded over them had started to slip through her fingers. She had spent months playing them against each other, using their emotions, their vulnerabilities, and their need for her to keep them in line. But now, as jealousy and suspicion deepened, she found herself trapped in the very web she had spun. It was Chuka, the youngest and most volatile of the three brothers, who first uncovered the truth of Martha's betrayal. Chuka had always been more rebellious than his brothers, more prone to acting on impulse and emotion. His relationship with Martha had begun as a battle of wills, a game of defiance and attraction that neither of them had fully understood. Over time, however, Chuka had found himself increasingly drawn to her, seduced by her attention and her challenge to his authority. What had once been a tense, antagonistic relationship had evolved into something darker, a dangerous entanglement that left him both resentful and dependent on her. But Chuka's innate suspicion had never fully left him. While his brothers had been more willing to fall under Martha's spell, Chuka remained wary of her motives. He sensed, deep down, that she was not to be trusted, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. It was this suspicion that led him to follow her one evening, after noticing that she had been spending more and more time alone in her quarters. Chuka's jealousy, which he had tried to suppress, had finally gotten the better of him. He needed to know where Martha's loyalties truly lay, and whether his brothers had reason to suspect what he already feared. The night was unusually quiet. The soft sound of crickets filled the air, and a gentle breeze rustled the palm trees that lined the estate. Chuka, restless and unable to sleep, had wandered the halls of the mansion, his mind churning with thoughts of Martha. He had seen her earlier that day, her expression distant, her words distracted. Something had shifted between them, and it gnawed at him, filling him with an unease he could no longer ignore. As Chuka passed by Martha's bedroom, he noticed a faint glow of light spilling out from under the door. She was still awake, and from the sound of voices, she was not alone. His heart raced, a sudden surge of adrenaline flooding his veins as he pressed his ear to the door. The voices were muffled, but unmistakable. Martha's low, sultry tone mingling with the deeper, more familiar voice of his brother Ife. A rush of cold dread washed over Chuka as he realized what he was hearing. His suspicions, long buried beneath the layers of his own conflicted feelings, had been confirmed. Martha was not his alone. She had been playing him, just as she had played Ife and likely Emeka too. Chuka's stomach twisted in knots as he stood frozen outside the door, listening to the soft murmur of voices that, in an instant, shattered his fragile illusions. Chuka's mind raced as he processed the betrayal. He had always known that Martha was manipulative, that she had a way of getting under people's skin and making them bend to her will. But he had never imagined that she would go so far as to pit him against his own brothers. The realization hit him with the force of a blow, and for a moment he felt dizzy, unsteady on his feet. Rage began to build within him, rising like a tide that threatened to overwhelm him. Chuka turned and walked away from the door, his fists clenched at his sides. His head was spinning, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of anger, confusion, and betrayal. He needed to confront Martha, to make her explain herself. But more than that, he needed to understand how deep the betrayal ran. Had she been sleeping with Emeka as well? Had she been manipulating all three of them, playing them against each other for her own twisted pleasure? The thought made him sick to his stomach, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next day, Chuka's mood was dark and brooding. He avoided his brothers, unwilling to face them with the knowledge he now carried. Every time he saw Ife, his blood boiled, and his resentment toward Emeka, the eldest and most dominant of the three, only deepened. How long had this been going on? How long had his brothers been involved with Martha, while he had been kept in the dark, believing that his relationship with her was something unique? Chuka's anger festered as the hours passed. By midday, he could no longer stand the tension. He sought out Emeka, who was in the study, going over the family's financial records. Emeka looked up from his work as Chuka entered the room, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. Chuka, his heart pounding in his chest, stared at his older brother, struggling to find the words to express the storm of emotions that churned within him. Emeka had always been the authority figure in the family, the one who took charge after their father's death. But now, in Chuka's eyes, Emeka was no longer the responsible elder brother he had once respected. He was a rival, a competitor for Martha's affections, a man who had betrayed not only Chuka's trust but the very foundation of their family. Unable to contain his anger any longer, Chuka blurted out the accusation, his voice shaking with rage. The words spilled out of him in a rush, each one landing like a hammer blow in the quiet room. Emeka, taken aback by the intensity of Chuka's outburst, stared at him in disbelief. But as the accusations sank in, Emeka's expression hardened, and a cold fury flickered behind his eyes. For a moment, the two brothers stood in silence, the air between them crackling with tension. Emeka's mind raced as he processed what Chuka had just revealed. Martha and Ife, it seemed impossible, yet the look in Chuka's eyes told him that it was true. And if Martha had been involved with Ife, what did that mean for his own relationship with her? Had he, too, been played, used in the same way that Chuka now claimed to have been? Emeka's heart pounded in his chest as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He had always prided himself on being in control of his emotions, of his life, of his family. But now, in the space of a few minutes, that control had been ripped away from him, leaving him reeling with a mixture of anger, confusion, and betrayal. As the silence stretched on, Emeka's fury began to build. He had always been the one to hold the family together, to maintain order in the wake of their father's death. But now everything he had worked for was falling apart, and at the center of it all was Martha, the woman who had seduced him, manipulated him, and turned him against his own brothers. Without a word, Emeka stood up from his desk and strode past Chuka, his jaw clenched in anger. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him: Martha. Martha had sensed that something was wrong the moment Emeka entered the room later that day. His usually calm, composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering anger that made her uneasy. She had grown used to controlling the situation, to playing the brothers against each other without them realizing it. But now she could feel the tide turning, and for the first time she found herself on the defensive. As Emeka confronted her, his voice low and dangerous, Martha tried to deflect his accusations. She had always been good at manipulating her way out of difficult situations, at twisting the truth just enough to maintain her control. But this time Emeka was not so easily swayed. He pressed her, his anger growing with each evasive answer she gave. The more she tried to explain, the more transparent her lies became, until finally Emeka saw through the facade she had so carefully constructed. The betrayal hit Emeka like a physical blow. Martha, the woman he had trusted, the woman he had been drawn to in his grief and loneliness, had been manipulating him all along. She had seduced not only him, but Ife and Chuka as well, playing them against each other for her own selfish ends. The realization was devastating. and for a moment, Emeka felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. As Emeka's anger reached its boiling point, Ife entered the room, drawn by the sound of raised voices. He, too, had sensed that something was amiss, though he hadn't yet pieced together the full extent of Martha's betrayal. But as soon as he saw the look on Emeka's face and the tension between him and Martha, Ife knew that whatever was happening, it was far worse than he had imagined. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Accusations flew, as Emeka revealed what Chuka had told him, and Ife, in turn, admitted his own involvement with Martha. The three brothers, once bound by their shared grief and the legacy of their father, now stood divided, each one grappling with the knowledge that they had been betrayed not only by Martha, but by each other. Martha, realizing that her carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to collapse, tried desperately to regain control of the situation. She pleaded with the brothers, attempting to play on their emotions, to convince them that she had acted out of love or loneliness, or some other excuse that would absolve her of responsibility. But her words rang hollow, and the brothers, each consumed by their own anger and sense of betrayal, were no longer willing to be manipulated. The argument grew more heated, voices rising as years of suppressed resentment and jealousy boiled to the surface. The brothers, each hurt by Martha's actions and by the knowledge that they had been played against one another, began to turn on each other, their once strong familial bond fracturing under the weight of the revelation. Chuka, his anger still raw from the previous night, lashed out at Ife, accusing him of being weak, of allowing Martha to control him. Ife, hurt and defensive, struck back, accusing Chuka of being reckless and selfish, of acting without thinking and making the situation worse. Emeka, caught between his two brothers, struggled to maintain his composure, but even he was not immune to the rising tide of anger and frustration. As the argument reached its peak, the unthinkable happened. In a moment of blind rage, Chuka lunged at Ife, his fist connecting with his brother's jaw. The force of the blow sent Ife stumbling backward, crashing into a nearby table. Emeka, shocked by the sudden violence, moved to intervene, but before he could stop it, the room erupted into chaos. The brothers, driven by their jealousy, anger, and betrayal, turned on each other, their fight fueled by months of simmering tension. Martha, the cause of it all, stood frozen, watching as the family she had manipulated for so long finally began to destroy itself. By the time the dust settled, the damage had been done. The once united Obi brothers were now irrevocably divided, their relationships shattered by the truth of Martha's betrayal. What had started as a game of manipulation had spiraled out of control, leading to a confrontation that none of them could have predicted and one that would change their lives forever. The confrontation that erupted between the Obi brothers, with Martha at the center, had torn the fragile fabric of their family apart. In the hours after the betrayal was uncovered, a volatile mix of anger, jealousy, and resentment filled the Obi household, the once stately home now reverberating with tension. The revelation that each of the brothers had been involved with Martha in secret had cracked their relationships wide open, and there was no going back. The calm that had once characterized their lives, even in the wake of their father's death, was now replaced by an undercurrent of simmering fury that none of them could control. The fallout from the confrontation with Martha hung heavily in the air. Emeka, Ife, and Chuka had retreated to separate corners of the house, each grappling with the truth in their own way. But the storm that had been brewing for months had not yet fully broken. There was still one final act to play out, one that would shatter the last remnants of their family bond and forever mark the Obi household with the stain of violence. For Emeka, the eldest, the betrayal cut the deepest. He had always prided himself on being the responsible one, the brother who had taken on the burden of the family's legacy after Chief Obi's death. He had believed, however mistakenly, that he could maintain order in the household, that he could manage the estate and protect his younger brothers from the chaos that lurked outside the walls of their home. But now, in the wake of Martha's revelation, Emeka's carefully constructed sense of control had been obliterated. He felt humiliated, emasculated by the knowledge that Martha had been using him, just as she had used Ife and Chuka. The woman he had allowed into his life, the one who had shared his bed and his secrets, had been manipulating him all along. Emeka had always been a man of restraint, someone who kept his emotions tightly in check. But now the restraint was slipping. His anger, once simmering beneath the surface, had begun to bubble over. He could feel it in his chest, a tightness that made it difficult to breathe, a pounding in his head that would not relent. The rage he felt was not only directed at Martha, but also at his brothers at Ife, who had been weak enough to fall for Martha's manipulations, and at Chuka, whose reckless behavior had allowed the situation to spiral out of control. Emeka had spent years trying to hold the family together, and now, in a matter of days, everything had fallen apart. In the quiet of his study, Emeka sat alone, his hands clenched into fists. He could still hear the echoes of the argument from earlier that day, the sound of Chuka's voice raised in anger, the accusations hurled back and forth between them. He had tried to keep the peace, to calm the situation, but it had been futile. Now, all that remained was the wreckage of their relationships, and Emeka had no idea how to put the pieces back together. Meanwhile, Ife, the middle brother, had withdrawn into himself, retreating to the small room where he kept his instruments and books. His world, already fragile and uncertain, had been shattered by the events of the last few days. He had always been the most sensitive of the three, the one who felt things more deeply, who carried the weight of his emotions in ways that neither Emeka nor Chuka could fully understand. The revelation that Martha had been using him, that she had never truly cared for him, had left him hollow, as though a part of him had been ripped away. Ife had never been able to express his anger in the same way as his brothers. Where Emeka's anger was cold and controlled, and Chuka's was fiery and impulsive, Ife's anger simmered quietly beneath the surface, manifesting as a deep sadness and a sense of betrayal that gnawed at him from the inside. He felt foolish for having believed in Martha, for having allowed himself to be drawn into her web. But more than that, he felt ashamed that he had let his relationship with her create a rift between him and his brothers, ashamed that he had been so easily manipulated by a woman who had cared for none of them. As Ife sat in his room, staring blankly at the pages of an open book, he felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The house, once filled with the sound of his father's voice, of family dinners and conversations, now felt like a tomb. The tension between the brothers had grown so thick that it seemed to suffocate him, leaving him gasping for air, desperate to escape the emotions that swirled around him. But there was no escape, not from this. Chuka, the youngest and most volatile, was pacing in his bedroom, his mind racing with anger and confusion. Of the three brothers, he had always been the one most prone to reckless behavior, the one who acted on impulse rather than thought. His relationship with Martha had been complicated from the start, built on defiance, attraction, and a twisted need for validation. He had never fully trusted her, even as he allowed himself to be drawn deeper into her web. Now, that mistrust had turned into full-blown rage. Chuka felt betrayed, not only by Martha but by his brothers as well. How could they have allowed this to happen? How could Emeka, who was supposed to be the leader, have been so blind? And Ife, always the sensitive one, how could he have let himself be taken in so easily? Chuka's mind raced with questions, each one fueling the fire of his anger. He felt like a caged animal, trapped in a situation he could no longer control. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the house continued to build. None of the brothers spoke to each other, each one isolated in his own corner of the house, nursing his own wounds. But the silence could only last so long. The emotions that had been simmering for months, anger, jealousy, resentment, were on the verge of boiling over, and it was only a matter of time before the final confrontation occurred. That evening, the storm that had been building finally broke. It began with a chance encounter in the hallway. Chuka, still pacing, had decided to confront Martha once and for all. He couldn't stand the silence any longer, the unanswered questions, the lies, the betrayal. He needed to face her, to make her admit what she had done. As he stormed down the hallway toward her room, he ran into Ife, who had emerged from his own isolation. The two brothers, already on edge, immediately fell into a heated argument. Chuka, his temper flaring, accused Ife of being weak, of allowing Martha to manipulate him. Ife, hurt and defensive, shot back, accusing Chuka of being reckless, of driving the family apart with his impulsive actions. The argument quickly escalated, the voices of the two brothers rising as they hurled accusations at each other. Emeka, hearing the commotion, emerged from his study, his face set in a grim expression. He had tried to avoid further conflict, but now, as he watched his younger brothers tear into each other, something inside him snapped. He could no longer hold back the anger that had been building within him for days, weeks, months. His calm, composed demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold fury that had been brewing just beneath the surface. Without a word, Emeka stepped between Ife and Chuka, his presence a sudden and imposing force. The brothers turned on him, their anger now directed at the man who had always been their leader, their protector. But in that moment, Emeka was no longer willing to play the role of the responsible elder brother. The betrayal had cut too deep, and now all that remained was rage. The argument spiraled out of control, the three brothers shouting over each other, their voices echoing through the house. Accusations flew, each one sharper than the last, each one landing like a blow. Chuka, his fists clenched, took a step toward Emeka, his face twisted with anger. He had always resented Emeka's authority, had always chafed under his older brother's control. Now, in the heat of the moment, that resentment boiled over. In a fit of rage, Chuka swung at Emeka, his fist connecting with his brother's jaw. Emeka staggered back, caught off guard by the sudden violence. Ife, horrified, moved to intervene, but before he could stop it, the fight had erupted into chaos. Emeka, his anger now fully unleashed, lunged at Chuka, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him hard against the wall. Chuka, unrepentant, shoved back, and within seconds, the two brothers were locked in a brutal struggle, their fists flying as years of suppressed tension and resentment exploded into violence. Ife, desperate to stop the fight, tried to pull them apart, but he was quickly shoved aside. The hallway, once a place of quiet and order, had become a battleground, the sounds of fists hitting flesh, of heavy breathing and grunts of pain, filling the air. Martha, hearing the commotion from her room, rushed out into the hallway, her eyes wide with shock and fear as she took in the scene before her. For a moment she froze, unsure of what to do. But then, as she watched Emeka and Chuka tear into each other, a new fear began to rise within her. This was not just a fight between brothers, this was a fight for control, a fight born of jealousy and betrayal, and it had been building for far too long. In the chaos of the struggle, no one noticed as Emeka reached for the heavy brass candlestick that sat on a nearby table. His eyes, wild with rage, locked onto Chuka's face as he swung the candlestick with all his strength. The sound of metal hitting bone was sickening, a sharp crack that echoed through the hallway. Chuka crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him as he lay motionless. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ife, his heart pounding in his chest, stared in horror at his younger brother's limp body. Martha, her hands trembling, took a step back, her face ashen. Emeka stood frozen, the candlestick still clutched in his hand, his chest heaving with the effort of the fight. His mind, clouded by rage, struggled to process what had just happened. The room was silent, save for the sound of Emeka's ragged breathing. Chuka didn't move. For a long moment no one spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. The anger that had fueled the fight had dissipated, leaving only the cold, hard reality of what had just occurred. Emeka dropped the candlestick, the sound of it clattering to the floor, shattering the silence. His hands, slick with blood, trembled as he stared down at Chuka's lifeless form. The realization of what he had done began to sink in, the full weight of it crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Martha, her eyes wide with shock, took a step forward, her hands outstretched as if to comfort him. But Emeka recoiled from her touch, his face contorted with a mixture of horror and guilt. This was her doing, he realized. This entire situation, the jealousy, the anger, the violence had all been set in motion by Martha's manipulations. But it was too late now. Chuka was dead. The Obi family, once a pillar of strength and unity, had been shattered beyond repair. The rage that had consumed them all had led to a tragedy that none of them could have foreseen. And now there was no going back. The murder of Chuka, born out of a fit of rage, had forever altered the course of their lives. What had once been a household filled with grief and tension had now become the scene of a crime, a place where brother had turned against brother, where anger had given way to violence, and where the final act of betrayal had resulted in death. The aftermath of Chuka's death was as silent and suffocating as the final moments of the storm that had ripped through the Obi household. The hallway, once a battleground of fraternal rage, now lay eerily quiet, the air thick with shock and horror. Chuka's lifeless body remained crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, the vivid red stark against the polished wooden floorboards. Emeka, Ife and Martha stood frozen in place, each grappling with the enormity of what had just transpired. For a long moment no one moved. The silence was heavy, as though the very house itself held its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Time seemed to stretch, the minutes bleeding into one another as the reality of Chuka's death began to sink in. The rage that had driven Emeka to strike the fatal blow had dissipated, leaving behind a cold, gnawing dread that settled deep in his chest. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears, but his mind remained numb, unable to fully process the enormity of what he had done. Ifis, face pale and eyes wide with horror, stood rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on his younger brother's lifeless form. He could scarcely believe what had happened. The argument, the violence, it had all spiraled out of control so quickly. One moment they had been shouting, fists flying in a heated exchange of blame and resentment, and the next Chuka was dead, killed by Emeka's hand in a moment of blind fury. Ife's stomach churned, and a wave of nausea washed over him as the reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. Chuka was gone forever. Nothing could change that. Martha was the first to move. She took a shaky step forward, her hands trembling as she stared down at Chuka's bloodied body. Her mind raced, desperately trying to grasp onto anything that would help her make sense of what had just unfolded. She had known that things had been spiraling out of control between the brothers, but she had never anticipated it would end like this. Chuka, the youngest, the most volatile, was dead. Emeka had killed him in a fit of rage, and now there was no turning back. The family had been irrevocably torn apart, and it was all her fault. Her manipulations, her lies, her desire for control had brought them to this moment. And now they would all have to live with the consequences. But Martha wasn't ready to accept defeat. Even as the weight of Chuka's death pressed down on her, her survival instincts kicked in. She had always been a woman who thrived in moments of crisis, and now, in the face of this unthinkable tragedy, she knew she had to act quickly if she had any hope of salvaging what remained of her life. They couldn't call the police, not yet. There would be questions, investigations, and accusations. And once the truth of their tangled relationships came to light, there would be no escaping the consequences. Martha knew this all too well. She turned to Emeka, who stood motionless, his face ashen, staring down at his blood-stained hands. His expression was a mixture of shock and horror, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that the life he had just taken belonged to his own brother. He was still holding the brass candlestick that had delivered the fatal blow, its weight seeming to drag him down, both physically and emotionally. Martha could see the guilt in his eyes, the anguish that was slowly consuming him. But now was not the time for remorse. They had to think. They had to act. Martha's voice, though shaky, was the first to break the oppressive silence. She spoke in a hurried, urgent whisper, her words tumbling out as she laid out her plan. They couldn't leave Chuka's body here, it was too risky. The blood would stain the floorboards, and the longer they waited, the harder it would be to explain the events of that night. They had to clean up the scene, get rid of the evidence, and most importantly, dispose of the body before anyone found out what had happened. Emeka, still in a state of shock, barely registered her words. His mind was clouded with guilt and confusion, his thoughts a whirlwind of regret and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had he allowed his anger to consume him to the point where he had killed his own brother? He felt sick to his stomach, his hands trembling as he dropped the candlestick onto the floor with a dull clatter. He wanted to turn back time, to undo what had been done. But the weight of reality pressed down on him, reminding him that there was no undoing the past. Ife, though equally horrified by what had transpired, was the first to respond to Martha's plan. He had always been more level-headed than Chuka, more thoughtful and measured in his actions. But now, faced with the gruesome reality of his brother's death, he found himself in a daze, unable to think clearly. Yet, despite his shock, he knew that Martha was right. They had to cover up what had happened. If the police got involved, the truth of their relationships with Martha would come out, and they would all be ruined. There was no other option. Together, the three of them, Emeka, Ife, and Martha, set about cleaning up the scene of the crime. The work was grueling, both physically and emotionally. Emeka, still dazed from the violence of his actions, moved mechanically, his mind numb as he scrubbed the blood from the floor. Each stroke of the rag felt like a penance, a futile attempt to wash away the guilt that now clung to him like a second skin. Ife worked beside him, his face set in a grim expression, though his hands shook as he wiped away the evidence of their brother's death. Martha directed them with a cold, calculated precision that belied the fear that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. She knew that if they didn't act quickly and efficiently, their entire plan would fall apart. Every moment that passed increased the risk of someone discovering what had happened. The other staff members in the household had retired for the night, but it wouldn't be long before they awoke and started their daily routines. They had to finish before dawn. Once the blood was cleaned up and the hallway restored to its former state, they turned their attention to Chuka's body. The sight of their brother, once so full of life and energy, now lying cold and motionless on the floor, was almost too much to bear. But they couldn't afford to dwell on their grief. There would be time for mourning later if they survived this. For now they had to act. Under Martha's direction, they wrapped Chuka's body in a large, heavy sheet, careful to cover the bloodstains that still marked his clothing. The task was grim and difficult, and the weight of his lifeless form was a harsh reminder of the irreversible nature of what had happened. Once the body was wrapped, they carried him out of the house, moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking the staff or alerting the neighbors. The night was dark, and the moon provided little light, casting long, eerie shadows across the estate as they made their way toward the dense woods that bordered the property. The decision to bury Chuka's body in the woods had been a practical one, born of necessity. The forest was vast and largely untraveled, its thick undergrowth providing ample cover for what they were about to do. If they could dig a deep enough grave, there was a chance that no one would ever find the body. It was a risk, of course there was always a risk, but it was the best option they had. As they reached the edge of the woods, the oppressive silence of the night seemed to close in around them. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the heavy breathing of the three as they carried their grisly burden into the trees. Once they found a secluded spot, hidden from view by the thick canopy of branches, Emeka and Ife began to dig. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Each shovelful of dirt felt like another layer of guilt being heaped upon them, another reminder of the terrible crime they had committed. Emeka's muscles ached, but he continued to dig, driven by the knowledge that they had no other choice. Ife, too, dug in silence, his face pale and drawn, his mind numb from the horror of the night's events. Martha stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She knew that this was just the beginning. Even if they managed to bury Chuka's body and cover up the crime, the guilt would haunt them forever. When the grave was finally deep enough, Emeka and Ife carefully lowered Chuka's body into the earth. The sight of their brother, once so vibrant, now lying motionless in a shallow grave, was almost too much to bear. But they forced themselves to continue, shoveling the dirt back into the hole, covering Chuka's body until there was nothing left to see. When they were finished, they smoothed the earth, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. It was a crude grave, hastily dug and hastily covered, but in the darkness of the night it would have to do. Once the burial was complete, the three of them made their way back to the house in silence. The weight of what they had done hung heavy in the air, suffocating in its finality. The cover-up, though necessary, did little to ease the burden of guilt that now settled over them like a shroud. They had buried their brother, but they could not bury the truth of what had happened. It would remain with them, gnawing at the edges of their conscience, a constant reminder of the night that had destroyed their family. As they re-entered the house, Martha immediately set about ensuring that the rest of the household would remain unaware of what had transpired. She issued orders to the staff, instructing them to remain away from the part of the house where the argument had taken place, using the excuse that she and the brothers needed privacy to grieve. She kept her composure, her voice steady, her gaze cold and unwavering, but inside she was trembling. The pressure of maintaining the facade was almost unbearable, but Martha knew that if she faltered, even for a moment, their entire plan would unravel. The next few days passed in a blur of tense silence and barely restrained panic. Emeka and Ife barely spoke, the weight of their shared secret driving a wedge between them that seemed impossible to bridge. They avoided each other's eyes, each man lost in his own thoughts, his own guilt. The house, once filled with life and energy, now felt like a tomb, a place where silence reigned and shadows lingered in every corner. The absence of Chuka, once so loud and unruly, now seemed deafening in its quietness. But despite their best efforts to maintain the illusion of normalcy, it wasn't long before the outside world began to take notice of Chuka's disappearance. Friends and neighbors, accustomed to seeing the youngest Obi brother out and about, began to ask questions. Where was Chuka? Why hadn't anyone seen him in days? At first, Martha and the brothers offered excuses. He had gone away for a few days to clear his head, they said, or he was dealing with personal matters. But as the days turned into weeks, the questions became more persistent, and it became clear that their story was wearing thin. It was only a matter of time before the authorities became involved. The Obi family, as one of the wealthiest and most influential in the region, could not easily hide the disappearance of one of their own. Eventually, a concerned family friend reported Chuka's absence to the police, and an investigation was launched. Detective Samuel Otieno was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being thorough and relentless in his pursuit of the truth. From the moment he arrived at the Obi estate, he sensed that something was amiss. The atmosphere in the house was tense, the air thick with unspoken words and hidden secrets. Though Martha, Emeka, and Ifal maintained their story that Chuka had left of his own accord, Detective Otieno wasn't convinced. There was something in their eyes, a flicker of fear, a tightness in their voices, that told him they were hiding something. Otieno began his investigation methodically, speaking with the household staff, Chuka's friends, and anyone who had interacted with him in the days leading up to his disappearance. The more he dug, the more inconsistencies he found in the Obi family's story. The staff, though loyal to the family, couldn't hide their unease. There were rumors of arguments, of tension between the brothers, of something dark lurking beneath the surface of the Obi household. And though no one could say for certain what had happened, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Otieno's suspicions were further fueled when he discovered that Chuka's belongings had been left behind: his wallet, his phone, and personal items that he would never have taken if he had left voluntarily. The detective knew that people didn't just vanish without a trace, especially not the son of a prominent family. There was more to this story, and he was determined to find out what. As the investigation progressed, the pressure on the Obi family intensified. The police began searching the estate, combing through the woods and questioning anyone who might have seen Chuka on the night of his disappearance. Martha, Emeka, and Ife did their best to maintain their composure, but the cracks in their facade were beginning to show. The guilt that had been gnawing at them for weeks was now compounded by the fear that their secret would be discovered. Emeka, in particular, struggled under the weight of the investigation. The guilt of having killed his brother was almost unbearable, and now, with the police closing in, the walls seemed to be closing in around him. He could barely look Ife in the eye, knowing that his actions had torn their family apart. And though Martha continued to urge him to remain calm, to stick to their story, Emeka knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. In the end, it was a single careless mistake that unraveled their carefully constructed lie. One of the household staff, while cleaning the hallway where the argument had taken place, noticed a faint blood stain that had been missed during the initial cleanup. The stain, though small, was enough to raise suspicion, and when the police were alerted, they brought in forensic experts to examine the area. It didn't take long for them to find traces of Chuka's blood, despite the family's efforts to cover it up. With the discovery of the bloodstain, the investigation took a new turn. The police, now armed with physical evidence, began to press the family for answers. Detective Otieno, sensing that the truth was close, intensified his questioning, pushing Emeka, Ife, and Martha to explain the inconsistencies in their story. Under the weight of the investigation and his own crushing guilt, Emeka finally broke. In a tearful confession, he admitted to killing Chuka in a fit of rage, detailing the events of that fateful night and the subsequent cover-up. His confession sent shockwaves through the community, and the once respected Obi family was thrust into the center of a scandal that would forever tarnish their name. In the end, Emeka was arrested and charged with manslaughter, while Martha and I faced charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to cover up the crime. The trial that followed was a spectacle, with the media descending on the small town of Koroma to cover every sordid detail of the family's downfall. The story of jealousy, betrayal, and murder captivated the public, and the Obi family, once one of the most powerful and respected in the region, was now a symbol of tragedy and scandal. As the dust settled and the trial drew to a close, the remnants of the Obi family were left to grapple with the wreckage of their lives. Emeka, once the proud heir to his father's legacy, now sat in a prison cell, haunted by the memory of the brother he had killed. Ife, though spared the worst of the legal consequences, was left adrift, his once promising future overshadowed by the weight of his family's disgrace. And Martha, the woman who had once manipulated her way into the center of the Obi family's world, now found herself utterly alone, her carefully constructed life reduced to ashes. The cover-up had failed. The investigation had uncovered the truth. And in the end, the Obi family was left with nothing but the bitter memory of what had once been and the painful knowledge of what they had lost.